Hey guys, tonight we begin with a sound that most people alive today have never heard, but which shaped the rhythm of human civilization for over 1,000 years. It's the sound of someone standing alone in absolute darkness, in temperatures that could kill, counting. Counting the hours, counting the bells, counting the heartbeats between one chime and the next, because if he loses count, if his fingers grow too numb to pull the rope, if sleep claims him even for a moment, people will die. Not dramatically, not heroically. They will simply freeze in their beds, or burn when no one sounds the alarm, or wake to find their children stolen by men who knew the watchman had failed. This is the story of the Winter Watch, and before this night is over, you will never hear a church bell the same way again.
The Winter Watch existed across virtually every civilization that experienced cold seasons, from ancient China to medieval Europe to colonial America. These were the men, and occasionally women, who stood guard through the longest nights of the year, not with weapons primarily, but with bells, with voices, with the simple act of counting time aloud when no one else could see the stars or the sundial or any other method of marking the passage of hours. They were the heartbeat of sleeping cities, and their job was, quite literally, to keep courage alive through sound alone.
What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the dedication required to stand alone in winter darkness for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours straight. It's what the bells actually meant to the people who heard them. Every chime was a message. Someone is awake. Someone is watching. You are not alone in the dark. In an era before electricity, before central heating, before any of the systems we take for granted, that message was the thin line between survival and surrender to despair. The watchman wasn't just telling time, he was telling an entire community that order still existed, that justice still functioned, that civilization hadn't collapsed while they slept.
Before we go deeper into this darkness together, let me ask you something. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself watching videos about medieval night watchmen at whatever ungodly hour it is where you are, you're exactly who I make these videos for. Take a moment to subscribe if you want more of these stories, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching. I'm genuinely curious whether you're a night owl yourself, keeping your own kind of watch. And if you're watching this in winter, in the dark, with the sound of wind outside your window, well, you will understand what I'm about to tell you better than anyone.
Now, let's talk about what winter actually meant before the modern era, because we have completely lost the visceral understanding of seasonal terror that shaped our ancestors' psychology. When we think of winter today, we think of inconvenience, shoveling driveways, higher heating bills, maybe a flight delay during the holidays. We do not think of winter as a time when a significant percentage of the population might simply cease to exist. But for most of human history, that was the mathematical reality.
Consider a medieval European city in December. The sun sets around 4 in the afternoon and doesn't rise until nearly 8 the next morning. That's 16 hours of darkness. 16 hours without natural light, without the warmth of the sun, without the ability to see more than a few feet in any direction unless you have fire. And fire, of course, is the other great terror of winter. Every source of warmth is also a source of potential catastrophe. The same hearth that keeps your family from freezing can, if unattended, consume your entire neighborhood in hours. In a densely packed medieval city with wooden buildings pressed together like kindling, a single unnoticed fire during winter could kill hundreds.
Into this darkness stepped the Winter Watch. The earliest recorded forms of organized night watches appear in Chinese records from the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago.
These weren't informal arrangements. They were sophisticated systems of rotating shifts, signal fires, and bell towers that could relay messages across entire provinces in hours. A watchman in one city hears 3 bells from the north. He knows that means fire. He rings 3 bells. The next watchman, miles away, hears them and does the same. Before modern telecommunications, this was the fastest way to communicate across distances in the dark. In medieval Europe, the system developed somewhat differently, but served similar purposes. By the 12th century, most cities of any significant size had established formal watch systems. These typically operated from sunset to sunrise, with watchmen stationed at gates, in towers, and patrolling the streets. The bells they rang served multiple functions. They marked the passing hours, so people could regulate their sleep and work. They signalled curfew and attend. They warned of fire or attack. And perhaps most importantly, they simply reminded everyone that someone was awake and alert.
The psychological impact of those bells cannot be overstated. Imagine lying in bed in the year 1350. It's December. It's been dark for hours, and it will be dark for hours more. Your house is barely warmer than the outside, and the outside might kill you. You have no way to know what time it is. You have no way to know if anyone else is awake. You have no way to know if something terrible is happening 2 streets over. You are essentially blind and deaf in a world where blindness and deafness could be fatal. Then you hear it. A bell. 1 chime. Then 2. It's the 2nd hour of the night. Someone is awake. Someone is counting. The world still makes sense. Here's where it gets interesting. The bells weren't just time-keeping devices, they were moral infrastructure. The watchman's call, which varied by region, but usually included both bells and a sung or shouted verse, always included a reminder of proper behavior. In German cities, the Nachtwächter would call out something like, "Hear ye, good people, and let me tell ye, the clock has struck 10. Put out your fire and light. Praise God the Lord." The message had layers. It told you the time. It reminded you to check your fires. And it invoked divine authority as the basis for civic order. This conflation of practical and spiritual was absolutely intentional. Medieval and early modern societies understood something we've largely forgotten, that practical order and moral order reinforce each other. When the watchman reminds you to bank your fires, he's not just preventing conflagration, he's reminding you that you're part of a community with obligations. When he invokes God, he's not just being pious, he's reminding potential criminals that their actions are observed not just by human eyes, but by a cosmic moral order. The watchman's call was, in effect, a nightly renewal of the social contract.
The men who took on this role occupied a peculiar position in society. They were essential but marginal, necessary but not quite respectable. The winter watch attracted those who, for various reasons, found themselves outside the normal daytime economy. Some were veterans too old or injured for other work. Some were immigrants who couldn't access guild systems. Some were men who had, for one reason or another, acquired reputations that made daytime employment difficult. In England, the watch was often a civic duty imposed on residents in rotation, which meant that anyone might find themselves standing in the cold at some point, from wealthy merchants to common labourers. This created an interesting social dynamic. The watchman knew things. He saw who came and went at odd hours. He knew which houses had sick members, because he could hear the coughing. He knew which couples were fighting, which businesses were failing, which young men were sneaking to visit which young women. The watchman occupied a liminal space between public and private, between day and night, between order and chaos. He was, in a very real sense, the keeper of the city's secrets. And the secrets he kept during winter were different than those of summer. Winter nights were longer, which meant more time on duty. They were colder, which meant the physical demands were extreme. They were darker, which meant the psychological pressure was intense. A summer watchman might deal with drunken revelers or the occasional thief. A winter watchman dealt with the fundamental questions of survival. Is that family's chimney too cold, suggesting they've run out of fuel? Is that sound a sick child who needs help? Has that house been too quiet for too long?
The equipment of a winter watchman tells its own story. In most European cities, they carried a lantern, a bell or horn, some kind of weapon for self-defense, and increasingly, by the 14th and 15th centuries, a clock. But the clock wasn't a timepiece as we understand it. Early portable timekeeping devices were wildly inaccurate. The watchman's clock was more of a reminder system. It helped him remember when to ring the bells, but the actual timing still depended on his own internal sense of passing hours, calibrated against the stars when they were visible and against pure guess when they weren't.
This meant that the watchman's count was in effect the official time. If he rang the bells early or late, that became the time. The community's rhythm synchronized to his rhythm. Consider what that means. One man's subjective experience of duration became the objective reality for everyone within earshot of his bells. This is a profound power and a profound responsibility. If the watchman is having a bad night, if the cold is making time crawl for him, his bells might be late, and the whole city adjusts. If he's eager for his shift to end, his bells might be early, and again, everyone adjusts.
The medieval world understood this, which is why watchmen were subject to strict oversight. They were checked on regularly by supervisors. They were required to sing or call out at specific points so that anyone awake could verify they were still on duty. They were fined or punished for falling asleep, for leaving their posts, for ringing the bells at wrong times. In some cities, the punishment for a watchman who slept through a fire that caused deaths was death itself. The logic was straightforward. You were entrusted with lives. You failed. Lives were lost. You forfeit your own.
But here's the thing about standing alone in winter darkness for hours on end. The human body and mind are not designed for it. Every winter watchman, no matter how dedicated, faced the same enemies. Cold attacked their extremities, numbing fingers that needed to ring bells and eyes that needed to scan for danger. Darkness played tricks on perception, creating shapes that weren't there, sounds that might or might not be real. Fatigue accumulated over the long hours, making every minute of the last stretch feel like an hour itself. And worst of all, isolation eroded the very sense of purpose that kept them going.
The winter watchman's greatest enemy wasn't cold or criminals. It was the whisper in his own mind that asked, "Does any of this matter?" In the small hours of a January night, when the bells have been rung 100 times and will need to be rung 100 more, when no one has stirred on the streets for hours, when the cold has settled into bones and the darkness has become oppressive, that question grows very loud. Why am I here? Would anyone notice if I stopped? Does it make any difference at all? The answer, of course, is that it made all the difference. But the watchman couldn't know that in the moment. He couldn't see the sleeping families who took comfort in his bells. He couldn't know that his faithful count was the only thing preventing a cascade of small surrenders that would ultimately collapse into chaos. He had to keep ringing on faith, on discipline, on the belief that order matters even when no one is watching you maintain it. This is perhaps the purest form of duty, to do what is necessary when you cannot see the results and may never receive acknowledgement.
Let me tell you about a specific winter, because this story needs a human face to be properly understood. In January of 1407, a young man named Heinrich found himself standing watch in the German city of Nuremberg. He was 23 years old, the son of a tanner who had died of plague 2 years earlier, leaving Heinrich with a small inheritance that wasn't quite enough to establish himself in any trade. The watch was supposed to be temporary, a way to earn wages while he figured out his next steps. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent, and by that January, Heinrich had been watching for 18 months.
The winter of 1407 was brutal across Central Europe. Rivers froze solid enough to drive carts across. Birds fell from trees, dead of cold mid-flight. The wolves, pushed by starvation, came closer to city walls than they had in living memory. The city council had doubled the watch, which meant longer shifts and less rest between them. Heinrich found himself on duty nearly every other night, 8 hours minimum, sometimes 12 when the regular relief was sick or had fled his obligations.
We know about Heinrich because of a lawsuit that emerged the following spring. A merchant had accused him of dereliction, claiming that Heinrich had failed to sound the alarm when a fire broke out in the merchant's warehouse on a night in late January. The merchant claimed that Heinrich must have been asleep, because a proper watchman would have smelled the smoke or seen the light. Heinrich's defense was detailed and preserved in the city records, and it gives us a rare window into what the Winter Watch actually experienced. According to Heinrich's testimony, the night in question had been particularly severe. The temperature had dropped to what he described as such cold that wine froze in the cup. His post was on the eastern wall, overlooking the Jewish quarter and the commercial district. He carried his usual equipment, a lantern with a candle that kept guttering in the wind, a bell, a horn, and a small hammer he could use to beat on doors if needed. What makes Heinrich's account so valuable is his description of the mental state he entered during long winter watches. He speaks of a kind of waking dream where the city below him seemed to fade in and out of reality. "I saw the houses," he said, "but I also saw through them as if they were painted on glass." He describes singing to himself to stay awake, old songs his mother had taught him, hymns from church, anything to keep his mind from sliding into the seductive warmth of unconsciousness. "Sleep in such cold is death," he said. "Every man who watches knows this. We sing because the singing keeps us alive." On the night of the fire, Heinrich was stationed on the eastern wall as usual. The merchant's warehouse was on the western side of the city, on the opposite end from Heinrich's post. A different watchman, an older man named Conrad, was responsible for that area. But Conrad had not shown up for his shift. He was later found in a tavern, drunk, claiming he had fallen ill and needed medicinal wine. With Conrad absent, then coverage. Heinrich was aware of this, but could not leave his own post to cover both areas. He had sent word to the watch captain, but the captain's response hadn't come before the fire started. The fire, Heinrich argued, began in the merchant's own negligence. An investigation later suggested that the merchant had left a brazier too close to stored cloth, hoping to prevent the cloth from becoming damp in the cold. The fire smouldered for hours before breaking into open flame, by which point it was too late to save the warehouse. Heinrich hadn't smelled the smoke because the wind was blowing the wrong direction. He hadn't seen the light because the fire was masked by the building's walls until it had already consumed the roof. By the time he saw the glow and rang the alarm, the damage was done. The court ultimately ruled in Heinrich's favor, but what interests me about this case isn't the legal outcome, it's the window it opens into the watchman's experience. Heinrich's description of his mental state, his strategies for staying awake, his acute awareness of his own limitations, all of this speaks to a job that was far more psychologically complex than simply standing and watching. The winter watchman had to manage his own consciousness as carefully as he managed his bells. He had to notice the moment when alertness began to slip and have techniques ready to pull himself back.
He had to know his own mind well enough to distinguish between real threats and the phantoms that cold and fatigue could produce.
This psychological dimension becomes even more interesting when we consider the spiritual framework in which these men operated. Heinrich, like most people of his time and place, lived in a world populated by supernatural forces. Devils were real. Ghosts were real. The darkness of winter nights wasn't just physically dangerous, it was spiritually perilous. The longest nights of the year were associated with increased demonic activity, with the wild hunt, with all manner of malevolent forces that used the cover of darkness to work their will. The watchman's bells were therefore not just practical signals, but spiritual weapons. Each chime pushed back the darkness in both senses.
Heinrich mentions this explicitly in his testimony. He says that on the hardest nights, when the cold and the dark seemed unbearable, he would imagine his bell as a blade that cut through evil. Each ring, he said, is a prayer made metal. This wasn't unique to Heinrich. Across medieval Europe, church bells were believed to have the power to drive away demons, disperse storms, and sanctify the air they sounded through. The watchman's bell carried this same spiritual weight. When he rang it, he wasn't just marking time, he was performing an exorcism of the night itself.
The theological underpinning of this belief was fairly sophisticated. In the medieval understanding, sound was a form of order imposed on chaos. God's first creative act was speech, "Let there be light." The bells echoed this divine pattern of using sound to establish order. Silence, by contrast, was associated with the void, with the formlessness that preceded creation. A city without bells was a city surrendering to that primordial chaos. The watchman, by keeping his count, by ensuring the bells rang on schedule, was participating in the ongoing work of creation. He was helping to maintain the cosmic order against the constant pull of dissolution. This might sound like a lot of philosophical weight to put on one man standing in the cold, but that's exactly the point. The medieval world didn't separate the practical from the spiritual the way we do. Everything had meaning layered upon meaning. The fire you banked at night was a practical safety measure and a symbol of keeping the domestic hearth alive. The bells you rang were a timekeeping device and a spiritual shield. The count you kept was a civic duty and a prayer. The winter watchman lived at the intersection of all these meanings, and his work was understood as important on every level.
This helps explain why communities invested so much in their watch systems, even when they were expensive to maintain. A properly equipped watch station required bells, which were not cheap. It required lanterns and the fuel to keep them lit. It required weapons and the training to use them. It required wages for the watchmen and salaries for their supervisors. For a small medieval city, this was a significant budget item. Yet cities paid it willingly, because the alternative was unthinkable. A city without a watch was a city without order. It was a city that had given up on itself.
The social importance of the watch becomes clearer when we look at what happened in cities where it broke down. During the Black Death of 1348-1350, many watch systems collapsed as watchmen died or fled. The effects were catastrophic beyond the plague itself. Without the watch, fires went unnoticed until they were unstoppable. Without the watch, gangs of looters moved through affected neighborhoods unopposed. Without the watch, the basic rhythms of civic life fell apart. People lost track of time. They lost track of each other. They lost the thread of connection that held communities together.
Contemporary accounts of plague-struck cities often mention the silence of the bells as particularly horrifying. One survivor in Florence wrote, "The bells had ceased, and with them hope." This wasn't just poetic sentiment. Without the bells, there was no way to know if anyone else was alive. Without the bells, there was no way to know if it was day or night, if order still existed anywhere, if there was any point in going on. The bells were proof of life. Their silence was announcement of death. After the plague passed, one of the first acts of recovering cities was to reconstitute their watches. This was treated as an urgent priority, often ahead of repairing walls or rebuilding churches. The reasoning was practical, but also psychological. A functioning watch was a signal that normal life could resume. It was permission for people to start trusting the night again, to stop sleeping in shifts, to unclench the constant vigilance that had gotten them through the crisis. The first bell to ring after a period of silence was often treated as a community celebration, a marker of resurrection.
Heinrich of Nuremberg lived through the aftermath of plague. Not the Great Plague of 1348, but one of the many recurrences that swept through Europe throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. He mentions this in his testimony, noting that his father had died of the sickness, and that he had survived, perhaps by luck, perhaps by grace. For Heinrich, the watch was more than employment. It was a way of participating in the recovery. By keeping his count, by ringing his bells, he was helping to prove that his city had survived, that it would go on, that the darkness hadn't won.
And here's where this story takes a turn that I find particularly compelling. The bells that Heinrich rang weren't just announcing the hours, they were announcing a specific system of hours that divided the night in a particular way. The medieval night was not a single undifferentiated block of darkness. It was divided into watches, typically 3 or 4, depending on the season and location. Each watch had its own name, its own associations, its own spiritual significance. The first watch was the time of settling, when fires were banked and doors secured. The middle watches were the dangerous hours, when evil was most active and vigilance most necessary. The last watch was the time of anticipation, when the night's grip began to loosen and dawn became thinkable. This division of darkness into named, distinct periods was itself a form of control. By giving each part of the night an identity, communities made the night less monolithic, less overwhelming. You didn't have to survive the night. You had to survive the first watch, then the second, then the third. Each bell that marked the transition was a small victory. You had made it this far. You could make it a little further. The counting itself was a survival strategy, breaking the unbearable into bearable units. The watchman was the keeper of this counting. His bells marked the transitions. His voice announced when one watch ended and another began. In doing so, he gave everyone within earshot a shared structure for experiencing the night. This might seem like a small thing, but it's actually profound. Shared time is the foundation of shared reality. When everyone agrees that it's the second watch, that creates a common framework for action, for expectation, for planning. The watchman's count made collective life possible after dark. This brings us to something I've been building toward all night, and it's this. The winter watch reveals something essential about how human societies maintain order. We often think of order as being maintained by force, by laws, by punishment, and those things matter. But the deeper foundation of order is something much more subtle. It's shared attention. It's the knowledge that someone is watching, not in a threatening way, but in a caring way. The watchman's bells weren't a threat, they were a promise. Someone is here. Someone notices. You matter enough to count.
Think about this in terms of modern parallels, because this isn't just ancient history. Every society has to solve the problem of the night, of the times when most people are asleep and the few who are awake could act without observation. We've solved it differently than our ancestors did. We have streetlights and security cameras and police patrols. But the underlying need is the same. People need to know they're not alone in the dark. They need to believe that someone is maintaining the count.
And here's where it gets really interesting. In many ways, we've lost what the bells provided. We have better security than our ancestors could dream of. Our nights are brighter, warmer, safer by every measurable standard. But we've lost the ritual acknowledgement that we're all in this together. We've lost the hourly reminder that someone is awake and watching. We've lost the bells.
The consequences of this loss are subtle but real. Modern societies struggle with what sociologists call anomie, a sense of normlessness, of disconnection, of being alone in a crowd. We have more communication technology than any humans in history, and yet many people report feeling more isolated than ever. Could part of this be the absence of what the bells provided? Not the information they conveyed, which was fairly minimal, but the message. Someone is counting. Someone cares. You are part of a community that holds together through the darkness.
I am not suggesting we bring back medieval night watches. That would be absurd. But I am suggesting that we've lost something valuable in our rush towards efficiency, and we might benefit from understanding what it was. The watchman's bells served purposes that our modern systems don't serve. They created a shared rhythm. They ritualized care. They made the invisible work of maintaining order visible and audible to everyone.
Heinrich of Nuremberg, standing on his wall in the brutal winter of 1407, was doing something more than keeping time. He was holding civilization together through sound alone. Every bell he rang was an assertion that the social contract still held, that someone still cared enough to count, that the darkness would not last forever. He didn't think of it in those terms, probably. He thought of it as his job, as the wages he needed, as the duty he owed. But the effect was the same.
We've covered a lot of ground tonight, and we're just getting started. In Part 2, we'll go deeper into the specific mechanics of the Winter Watch, the equipment, the training, the hierarchy of watchmen from the lowliest bell ringer to the captain who supervised them all. We'll look at how different cultures approached the problem of the winter night, from the firebrand carriers of ancient Rome to the drum-beating watchmen of medieval China. We'll examine the crimes that flourished in winter and the justice systems that tried to prevent them. And we'll meet more people like Heinrich, people whose names we know only because something went wrong, preserved in court records and city archives as witnesses to the strange, difficult, essential work of keeping the night at bay.
But for now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, know this: someone is counting, someone is watching. The bells still ring even if we've forgotten how to hear them, and the work of the Winter Watch goes on, in different forms, in different hands, but with the same essential purpose: to hold back the dark, to keep courage alive, to remind everyone who can hear that they are not alone.
Stay with me. The night is long, and there's so much more to tell. In the Chinese city of Kaifeng, around the year 1100, a different kind of watchman is preparing for his shift. His name is lost to history, but his equipment is not. It has been carefully documented by court officials who tracked every aspect of the city's administration. This watchman carries a drum rather than a bell. The drum hangs from a strap across his chest, and he strikes it with a padded mallet that produces a sound both deep and penetrating. The rhythm he drums is not random. It follows a precise pattern: 3 beats, then a pause, then 1 beat. This pattern means all is well in the northeast quarter. Different patterns mean different things. 5 rapid beats means fire. A steady rolling beat means intruders.
The system is essentially a spoken language translated into percussion, allowing messages to travel across the enormous city even when the human voice cannot carry. Kaifeng at this time is the largest city in the world, with a population of over 1 million people, packed into an area roughly the size of medieval Paris, but with 10 times the population density. The logistics of watching such a city are staggering. There are hundreds of watchmen on duty every night, organized into squads of 10, each squad responsible for a specific sector. The squads report to district captains, who report to a central watch commander, who reports directly to the city's magistrate. This hierarchy exists because in a city of 1 million people, a missed fire alarm could mean tens of thousands dead.
The Chinese system is more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Europe, but it's responding to the same fundamental problem. How do you maintain order in the dark? The solution is layers upon layers of redundancy. Each watchman has a specific route. Each route overlaps with adjacent routes. Each sound signal can be heard by multiple watchmen, who relay it forward. If one watchman fails, the system doesn't collapse. The Chinese understood something that European cities would take centuries to learn. One watchman is a point of failure, but a system of watchmen is resilient.
But resilience comes at a cost. The Chinese watch system required enormous resources to maintain. Watchmen had to be paid, trained, equipped, supervised, and replaced when they inevitably burned out from the physical demands of the work. The drums alone were expensive, crafted from special materials to produce sounds that would carry through the dense urban air. The signal system required constant updating as the city grew and changed, and the whole apparatus was only as good as the discipline of its weakest member, which meant constant vigilance against corruption, laziness, and simple human frailty.
Winter made everything harder. Kaifeng sits on the Yellow River Plain, which means cold winds from the northern steppes sweep through with nothing to block them. The winter of 1100 was particularly brutal, with recorded temperatures that turned the river to ice and killed thousands in the surrounding countryside. The watchmen's drummers cracked in the cold. Their hands lost the dexterity needed to maintain the complex rhythms. The city council responded by issuing special winter equipment: fur-lined gloves with separate finger holes, hand warmers filled with slow-burning charcoal, double-layered drumheads that could withstand the temperature swings. It wasn't enough. Watchmen still dropped from exposure. The system still struggled.
This pattern repeats across every winter watch system we have records of. No matter how clever the design, no matter how dedicated the personnel, winter eventually won battles against human endurance. The question was never whether the system would be perfect. The question was whether it would be good enough. Could it catch fires before they spread too far? Could it deter criminals who would otherwise have free rein? Could it maintain the fiction of order even when order was, in truth, desperately fragile? The answer, usually, was yes. Barely. At great cost. But yes.
Let's cross back to Europe and look at the equipment of a typical winter watchman in more detail, because the technology tells a story. The lantern is the most visible piece of equipment, literally. It's a small metal frame with horn panels that let light through while blocking wind. The horn is translucent but not transparent, which means the light is diffused into a soft glow rather than a sharp beam. This is actually an advantage. A sharp beam would create stark contrasts that would make it harder to see in the surrounding darkness. The diffused glow maintains the watchman's night vision, while still providing enough light to navigate and to signal his presence.
Inside the lantern is a candle, and the choice of candle matters enormously. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, are cheap but smell terrible and produce smoky flames. Beeswax candles burn cleaner and brighter, but cost 5 to 10 times as much.
Most cities provided watchmen with something in between. Tallow candles with a small proportion of beeswax mixed in, a compromise between budget and function. In winter, the candles burned faster because the air was drier and the wick drew fuel more quickly. A summer shift might use 2 candles, a winter shift might use 4 or 5.
The bell is usually brass or bronze, suspended from a wooden handle or mounted on a frame that the watchman can carry. The size varies by city and by the watchman's specific role. A stationary watchman in a tower might have access to a large bell that could be heard for miles. A patrolling watchman carries something smaller, maybe 6 inches across, with a sound that carries a few hundred yards at most. Some watchmen carry multiple bells of different sizes for different signals. A small bell for routine hour marking, a larger one for emergencies. The winter air, dense and cold, actually helps sound travel, which means the bells carry further than in summer. A winter watchman's call might reach ears that would miss it in July.
The weapon is typically a pole weapon of some kind, a halberd, a pike, or a simple staff with a metal tip. Swords are rare because they're expensive and require training that most watchmen don't have. The pole weapon serves multiple purposes. It's a walking stick on icy streets. It's a tool for reaching windows or doors from a safe distance. It's a probe for testing suspicious bundles in dark corners. And yes, in extremis, it's a weapon, though most watchmen hope never to need it as such. The pole is also a signaling device. Banging it against cobblestones creates a distinctive sound that carries further than a voice and tells everyone within earshot that the watch is active.
The clothing is perhaps the most important equipment of all. A winter watchman's outfit is designed for stationary endurance rather than active movement. Multiple layers of wool provide insulation, with the outermost layer often treated with lanolin or other waterproofing agents to shed snow and light rain. Gloves are essential but tricky. They need to be warm enough to prevent frostbite, but thin enough to manipulate bells, lanterns, and weapons. Most watchmen wore fingerless gloves with a mitten cover that could be folded back when dexterity was needed. Footwear was heavy leather boots stuffed with straw or fur, often several sizes too large to accommodate extra wrapping around the feet.
Even with all this equipment, survival was not guaranteed. Watchmen died every winter. They froze at their posts. They slipped on ice and struck their heads. They were killed by criminals who knew that a single watchman, alone in the dark, was vulnerable no matter what weapon he carried. The job attracted those without better options, precisely because it was dangerous, poorly paid, and socially marginal. The men who stood the winter watch were often the same men who would be on the streets anyway: the poor, the dispossessed, the veteran, the immigrant, the indebted. The watch was better than begging, but not by much.
If you've made it this far into the darkness with me, you're someone who appreciates the details that make history real. If that little thrill of recognition just hit you, the sense of suddenly understanding something about the past that you'd never considered, that's exactly why I make these videos. The subscribe button is there if you want more of these moments.
Now let's talk about the hierarchy of the watch, because there's more to this than one man with a bell. A functioning watch system required layers of organization that mirror modern emergency services more closely than you might expect. At the bottom were the regular watchmen, the Heinrichs who walked their beats and rang their bells. Above them were the corporals, experienced watchmen promoted to supervise teams of 5 to 10. Above the corporals were the sergeants, who coordinated multiple teams across a district. Above the sergeants was the watch captain, who commanded the entire night watch of a city and reported to civil authorities.
The watch captain's job was essentially executive. He set schedules, assigned posts, managed equipment, handled discipline, and served as the point of contact between the watch and the city government. In larger cities, the captain might have a small staff of clerks and assistants. He was typically a man of some social standing, often a retired military officer or a member of the merchant class seeking civic influence. The captain didn't walk beats himself, but he was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his watch. If a fire spread because his men were negligent, he answered to the council. If a prominent citizen was robbed, he explained himself to the mayor.
Below the captain, the sergeants were the true backbone of the system. These were the men who knew every beat, every trouble spot, every watchman's strengths and weaknesses. A good sergeant could sense when a district was about to boil over, when a watchman was close to breaking, when something in the night felt wrong. Sergeants were typically promoted from the ranks of experienced watchmen, men who had survived years of winter nights and developed the instincts that can't be taught. They were paid significantly more than regular watchmen, but still less than skilled tradesmen. The job was a step up, but not a comfortable living.
The corporals occupied an awkward middle position. They had authority over regular watchmen, but little real power. They were expected to lead by example, which meant they walked the same cold beats and suffered the same hardships as their men. A corporal who tried to pull rank or claim privilege would quickly lose the respect of those under him, and a watchman without the respect of his peers was vulnerable in ways that made the job even more dangerous. The corporal's real value was as a relay point. Information flowed up to him from the watchman and down to him from the sergeants. He was a node in a communication network that had to function in conditions that made communication nearly impossible.
In winter, this hierarchy faced stresses that could cause it to buckle. When temperatures dropped severely, watchmen started looking for any excuse to leave their posts. Sergeants had to decide when a man's complaints of illness were genuine and when they were malingering. Captains had to juggle personnel who were steadily depleted by cold and fatigue against coverage requirements that didn't shrink just because conditions were harsh. The system as a whole had to decide, do we maintain standards and let men freeze, or do we relax standards and accept the consequences?
Most cities found themselves forced toward the latter. Court records from medieval Europe are full of cases where watchmen failed to appear, fell asleep, or abandoned their posts during winter. The punishments were officially severe: fines, flogging, even execution in extreme cases. Impossible. The system survived because it lowered its expectations when it had to, accepting partial coverage and hoping that whatever calamities occurred could be contained. The crimes that flourished in winter were different from summer crimes. Summer brought crimes of opportunity: street robbery, pickpocketing, drunken brawls spilling out of taverns. Winter brought crimes of desperation: burglary by the starving, theft of fuel by the freezing, violence born of cabin fever among people trapped in close quarters for months. The winter criminal was often more sympathetic than the summer criminal, but also more dangerous. A starving man breaking into a grain storage isn't looking to avoid confrontation. He's looking to survive, and survival can drive people to extremes. The watchman's role in winter crime prevention was more about presence than pursuit. Chasing a fleeing criminal through icy streets in the dark was nearly impossible, and attempting it was as likely to result in the watchman's injury as the criminal's capture. Instead, the winter watchman focused on making his presence known, loudly and continuously. His bells, his calls, his lantern bobbing through the streets, all of these signals told potential criminals that the night was not unobserved. The deterrent effect was the point. Actual captures were rare and often accidental. Fire remained the supreme terror, the crime that could never be deterred because it was usually not a crime at all. House fires in winter were almost always accidents: a candle knocked over by a drowsy child, a hearth allowed to throw sparks onto a dry floor, a chimney clogged with soot, finally igniting.
The watchman's job was to spot the first signs, the glow in a window that shouldn't have a fire, the smoke rising from an unexpected location, and to raise the alarm before the fire could spread to adjacent buildings. In the dense construction of medieval cities, a few minutes made the difference between a contained incident and a neighborhood-consuming disaster.
The fire-watching function of the Winter Watch explains why many watchmen were stationed in towers rather than on patrol. A man walking the streets can only see a limited area. A man in a tower can survey the entire city, watching for the telltale glow. Tower duty was both easier and harder than patrol duty. Easier because you didn't have to walk. Harder because the towers were unheated and caught the wind. A tower watchman might have a brazier with coals for warmth, but he had to be careful not to let it smoke or flare, lest his own fire alarm the city he was supposed to be protecting.
In Nuremberg, where Heinrich served, the main watchtower was the Sinwellturm, a circular stone structure with openings on all four sides that gave a view across the entire city. The tower watchmen worked in pairs, one facing north and east, the other facing south and west. They were not allowed to speak to each other, except to relay observations. They were not allowed to sit. They were not allowed to have any source of entertainment that might distract them from continuous visual scanning. Their job, for 8 hours at a time, was to look at the city and notice anything unusual.
The psychological research on vigilance tasks like this is unambiguous. Human beings are terrible at them. Our attention naturally wanders after about 20 minutes of monotonous observation. After an hour, we start missing obvious signals. After several hours, we might as well not be watching at all. Medieval watch commanders understood this intuitively, which is why they mandated behaviors designed to combat attentional drift. The bells had to be rung at specific intervals, forcing the watchman to take a physical action that broke the monotony. The calls had to be sung or shouted, engaging different cognitive systems. The rounds had to be walked in patterns that changed throughout the night.
These mandated behaviors created an interesting dynamic. The watchman's external behavior was strictly controlled, but his internal experience was his own. He might be ringing bells and singing calls, while his mind was miles away, thinking about debts or lovers or grievances. The system relied on the assumption that the physical behaviors, once habituated, would continue even when attention wandered. The bells became automatic, the calls became reflexive, the scanning pattern became embodied. The watchman might be daydreaming, but his body kept doing its job.
This is actually a profound insight into how humans can maintain difficult behaviors over long periods. We can't will ourselves to pay attention for 8 hours straight, but we can develop habits that run independently of attention, behaviors that have been practiced so many times they no longer require conscious effort. The winter watchman who survived multiple seasons was the one who had turned his job into a series of automatic routines, freeing his conscious mind to manage the emotional and psychological challenges, while his body went through the motions of vigilance.
The justice system that supported the Winter Watch was both brutal and pragmatic. Watchmen had authority to detain anyone they found suspicious, and suspicious was defined broadly enough to catch almost anyone on the streets after curfew. The curfew itself was the foundation of the system. By declaring that no legitimate person should be out after dark, authorities gave watchmen a simple rule to enforce. Anyone you encounter is by definition violating curfew. The burden is on them to prove they have a legitimate reason for being out, not on you to prove they don't.
This created enormous potential for abuse, and abuse certainly occurred. Watchmen extorted bribes from those who could pay to avoid detention. They harassed those they personally disliked. They turned blind eyes to the crimes of the powerful while cracking down on the poor. The same social marginality that made watchmen willing to take the job also made them susceptible to corruption. A man with nothing to lose might be loyal to his duty, or he might be loyal to whoever offered him the best deal.
Cities tried various approaches to limit corruption. Some required watchmen to post bonds, forfeited if they were caught taking bribes. Some rotated watchmen frequently to prevent them from developing cozy relationships with the criminals in their areas. Some paid watchmen bounties for captures, hoping that financial incentive would outweigh the temptation of bribes. None of these approaches worked completely. Corruption remained endemic to watch systems throughout their history, a cost of doing business that communities tolerated because the alternative was no watch at all. The quiet justice that emerged from the Winter Watch was often informal. The watchman on his beat knew which households were struggling, which children were wandering, which old people were alone. He had the discretion to look the other way when a father stealing a chicken to feed his family, to give a warning instead of making an arrest, to create a little space in the rigid system for human mercy. This discretionary justice was technically illegal, but widely practiced. The watchman was the human face of authority in the darkness, and most watchmen recognized that inflexible enforcement would make the job impossible.
Heinrich's testimony includes an interesting passage about this informal justice. He describes a night when he encountered a woman he recognized, the wife of a baker in his neighborhood, carrying a bundle through the streets well after curfew. The bundle was clearly stolen goods. He could see the shape of loaves beneath the cloth. Technically, he should have detained her and reported the theft. Instead, he asked where she was going. She was bringing the bread to her sister's family, whose husband had been injured and couldn't work. Heinrich told her to go quickly and stay off the main streets. "I could not arrest her," he testified, "for doing what I would do myself if my family were hungry." This was mercy, but it was also sound judgment. Arresting a baker's wife for feeding the starving would not have made Nuremberg safer.
The interplay between formal and informal justice was one of the defining characteristics of the Winter Watch. On paper, the rules were clear. Curfew was curfew, theft was theft. The watchman's job was enforcement. In practice, the watchman made dozens of discretionary decisions every night, judging which violations threatened order and which were merely technical infractions that could be safely ignored. This discretion was both the system's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allowed for flexibility and humanity. It also allowed for inconsistency and injustice.
Consider the difference in treatment between a wealthy merchant found on the streets after curfew and a poor laborer in the same situation. The merchant could claim urgent business, could name powerful friends, could offer bribes that made the encounter worthwhile for the watchman. The laborer had none of these defenses. The same act, the same violation, resulted in very different outcomes depending on who committed it. This was not fair in any abstract sense, but it was how the system actually worked. The Winter Watch enforced order, but it enforced a specific kind of order that preserved existing hierarchies. Yet even within this unequal system, there were moments of genuine justice. Watchmen did catch murderers. They did save lives by spotting fires early. They did provide a level of protection that allowed ordinary people to sleep more soundly than they would have otherwise. The protection was imperfect and inequitably distributed, but it was real. And for those cold winter nights when the bells kept ringing and the calls kept sounding, even the poorest resident of a medieval city knew that someone was trying to hold back the darkness.
Let me tell you about another winter, this one in England. The year is 1381, and the city is London, still recovering from the peasants' revolt that had shaken the kingdom to its foundations earlier that year.
The revolt had been suppressed, its leaders executed, but the sense of vulnerability remained. The city's watch was larger than ever before, reinforced by men drafted from the guilds and supervised by royal officials who trusted no one. The winter that followed was bitter, and the extended watch was straining to cover its commitments. Among the drafted watchmen was a man named John Atwood, a carpenter by trade, who had been pressed into service as part of his guild's contribution to the watch. John's records survive because he was involved in a complicated legal dispute about compensation for the time he spent on watch duty, and his testimony gives us an unusual perspective, that of someone who didn't choose this work and didn't want it.
John's complaints are extensive and vivid. He describes the equipment provided as inadequate, a cloak not worth a farthing that let the wind through, boots that had been worn by previous watchmen until the soles were paper-thin, a lantern that guttered out within the first hour. He describes his fellow draftees as useless, men who had never walked the streets at night, who jumped at shadows, who couldn't tell the difference between a drunk and a threat. He describes the cold as personal. It seeks out your bones as if it bore a grudge. And he describes the fear that even skeptics like him felt, standing alone in the dark in a city that had recently seen mob violence.
What makes John's account valuable is precisely his reluctance. He's not romanticizing the watch or claiming noble purpose. He's complaining bitterly about a duty he never asked for and couldn't escape. And yet, even in his complaints, we see the essential function the watch served. John admits that on his coldest, most miserable nights, the sound of bells from adjacent sectors reassured him. "When I heard the bells," he wrote, "I knew I was not alone in my suffering." The bells connected him to other men enduring the same ordeal. They created solidarity among strangers who would never have spoken otherwise. John's watch service lasted through the winter of 1381-1382 and into the spring. By the time he was released from duty, he had developed skills he hadn't had before. How to move quietly through streets, how to spot trouble at a distance, how to project authority without provoking confrontation. He had also developed a grudging respect for the professional watchmen who did this work year after year. They are either saints or madmen, he concluded, and I suspect madmen, for no saint would choose this life. The mixture of professional and drafted watchmen created interesting dynamics within the watch itself. Professionals resented the amateurs who had to be trained from scratch every time a new draft arrived. Amateurs resented the professionals who seemed to know everything and enjoyed making the newcomers feel foolish. The sergeants and corporals had to manage these tensions while maintaining effective coverage. A divided watch was a weak watch, and weakness in winter could be fatal. The solution in most cities was to pair professionals with amateurs. Each drafted watchman was assigned to work alongside an experienced man who could teach him the basics and intervene when he made mistakes. This mentorship system worked reasonably well, though it created its own problems. Professionals who resented the amateurs might sabotage their training subtly, giving bad advice or neglecting to warn about dangers. Amateurs who resented being subordinate might ignore their mentor's guidance and create problems for everyone. The human element, as always, proved harder to manage than the technical challenges. Winter magnified all these tensions. Cold and fatigue shortened tempers. The long nights gave ample opportunity for grudges to fester. By February of most years, the watch was held together more by habit than by any positive motivation. Men showed up because they had been showing up, went through the motions because the motions were familiar, rang the bells because their hands knew the rhythm. The sense of mission that might have animated the watch in October had long since frozen. And yet the watch held. Winter after winter, century after century, the bells kept ringing. The calls kept sounding, the lanterns kept bobbing through the streets. The system was never perfect, never incorruptible, never free from the human frailties of those who staffed it. But it was there. It showed up. It counted the hours and marked the time and reminded everyone within earshot that civilization hadn't collapsed while they slept. In the end, that's what survival looks like. Not heroic triumphs, but mundane persistence. Not dramatic victories, but ordinary people doing their jobs in the dark.
We're deep into the darkness now, and we still have territory to cover. In our final part, we'll examine what happened to the Winter Watch as the world changed around it. We'll watch the introduction of mechanical clocks transform the watchman's role. We'll see how the lantern evolved from a simple candle holder into the streetlight that still illuminates our cities. We'll follow the watch system as it crossed the Atlantic to colonial America, where it adapted to new challenges and new failures. And we'll ask the question that has been building all night. What have we lost, and what might we gain by understanding what the bells once meant?
The hour is late, the cold is deep, but we're not done counting yet.
Something changed in the 14th century that would eventually kill the Winter Watch, though nobody at the time recognized it for the death sentence it was. In the towers of European churches and town halls, craftsmen began installing a new kind of device, the mechanical clock. These early clocks were crude by modern standards, losing or gaining several minutes per day, requiring constant adjustment and maintenance. But they did something no technology had ever done before. They counted time without human intervention. They rang bells automatically, and in doing so, they made the watchman's count unnecessary. The transition didn't happen overnight. For centuries, mechanical clocks and human watchmen coexisted, each serving slightly different functions. The clock in the tower told the approximate hour to anyone within earshot. The watchman on his beat confirmed that hour, added the important information that all was well, and provided the human presence that mechanical chimes could never replace. But slowly, inexorably, the clock's reliability improved, while the watchman's role narrowed. By the 17th century, in many European cities, the timekeeping function had been entirely transferred to clockwork. The watchman remained only for fire warning and crime prevention. This stripping away of the watchman's temporal function was more significant than it might appear. The watchman had not merely been telling time, he had been creating time, imposing human rhythm on the formless dark, asserting that hours existed because someone was counting them. The mechanical clock took this assertion out of human hands entirely. Time became something that happened to people rather than something people made together. The watchman's count had been an act of collective will. The clock's chime was simply physics. The change in how communities experienced time was subtle but profound. With a human watchman, time had a personal quality. You knew who was counting. You might know his name, his habits, his voice. When he called the hour, it was communication between neighbors. When the clock struck, it was announcement from nowhere. The clock had no stake in whether you heard it or not. It had no investment in your survival through the night. It was indifferent in a way the watchman could never be. Parallel to the rise of mechanical timekeeping came another technological development that would reshape the watchman's world: improvements in artificial lighting. The lantern that had been the watchman's badge and tool evolved through the 17th and 18th centuries, from a simple candle holder into increasingly sophisticated devices. Oil lamps provided brighter, steadier light. Mirrored reflectors concentrated that light into beams that could illuminate from a distance. Eventually, in the 19th century, gas lighting would begin to transform streets themselves. turning the darkness that had defined the watchman's domain into something approaching perpetual twilight.
Gas lighting didn't arrive everywhere at once. London began installing gas street lamps in the 1810s. Paris followed shortly after. Smaller cities and towns remained in darkness for decades longer. But where the lights came, they fundamentally altered the relationship between civilization and night. The terror that had required watchmen to combat was, quite literally, illuminated away. Criminals couldn't hide in shadows that no longer existed. Fires could be spotted by anyone passing by. The physical conditions that had made the winter watch necessary were being systematically eliminated.
The watchmen themselves observed these changes with mixed feelings. Some welcomed the lights, which made their jobs safer and easier. Others recognized the lights as their eventual replacement. A German Nachtwächter, writing in 1847, complained that the new gas lamps had made him feel unnecessary as a fifth wheel on a coach. He could see the writing on the wall. When the streets stayed bright through the night, who needed a man with a lantern? When clocks kept reliable time, who needed a man to count the hours? The watch was becoming obsolete, even as individual watchmen continued walking their beats.
But before the watch died in Europe, it crossed the Atlantic and experienced one final flowering in colonial America. The American colonies inherited the English watch system, complete with its mixture of professional and drafted personnel, its hierarchy of corporals and sergeants and captains, and its fundamental premise that the night must be guarded by human attention. The New World presented new challenges, vast distances between settlements, hostile indigenous populations, and winters in New England that made European cold seem mild by comparison.
Boston established its night watch in 1636, just 6 years after the city's founding. The watch was modelled on English practice, but adapted to colonial conditions. There were no towers tall enough for effective fire surveillance, so the watch remained exclusively on patrol. There were no guild systems to draft personnel, so the watch relied on a combination of paid professionals and compulsory service by all adult male citizens. And there was no expectation that the government would provide adequate equipment, so watchmen often supplied their own lanterns, cloaks, and weapons.
The New England winter presented the colonial watch with conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Temperatures routinely dropped to levels that European cities rarely experienced. Snow could accumulate to depths that made normal patrol routes impossible, and the darkness of a colonial winter night in a settlement without the accumulated glow of thousands of candles that a European city produced was more absolute than anything the Old World watchman faced. A Boston watchman in January 1650 was alone in the dark, in a way his London counterpart could barely imagine.
The colonial watch developed innovations in response to these conditions. Watchmen were issued special equipment for extreme cold, multiple layers of fur, hand muffs that could hold heated stones, boots designed for snowshoes. The patrol routes were shortened in severe weather, with more frequent relief so no man was exposed for too long. And the watch call was adapted to American circumstances, replacing references to English landmarks with local geography, and adding warnings about wolves that would have been irrelevant in London.
The colonial watch also faced a challenge unknown in Europe, the frontier. A European city had walls, defined boundaries, clear distinctions between inside and outside. A colonial settlement often had nothing but a gradually thinning density of buildings before the wilderness began. The watchman's patrol might bring him to the edge of the known world, where the next step would take him into territory that belonged to no one he recognized as authority. The psychological weight of this boundary was immense. The watchman stood at the edge of civilization in the most literal possible sense.
Native Americans understood the vulnerability this created. Attacks on colonial settlements often came at night, and often in winter, when the watch was most stretched and the defenders most weakened by cold. The watchman was sometimes the first to die in such attacks, killed silently before he could raise an alarm. This danger elevated the colonial watchman's role from mere civic duty to military significance. He was the first line of defense against an enemy that struck from the darkness. His vigilance could mean the difference between a settlement surviving and a settlement being erased. We have accounts from several colonial watchmen who survived attacks, and their testimony illuminates the terror of that particular duty. One man, whose name the records give only as Thomas P., describes a night in 1676 during King Philip's War, when he was patrolling the perimeter of a small Massachusetts settlement. He heard nothing unusual. He saw nothing, but something made him pause and listen more carefully. A silence too quiet, he wrote later. The night creatures had stopped making noise. He ran back toward the center of the settlement, shouting his alarm, and that warning gave the settlers enough time to prepare a defense. The attack came minutes later. Without his alarm, Thomas P. believed, everyone would have died. The instinct Thomas P. describes, that sense of wrong silence, appears repeatedly in colonial watch accounts. Watchmen learned to listen not just for danger, but for the absence of the usual sounds that signified safety. Crickets, owls, foxes, the wind through specific trees, all of these created a baseline of normal night noise. When the baseline changed, something was wrong. This sensory training was passed from experienced watchmen to newcomers, an oral tradition of survival that had no written manual but was no less systematic for being unwritten.
The colonial winter watch reached its peak importance during the Revolutionary War, when the need for night security extended to military concerns. The Continental Army relied heavily on watch systems to prevent surprise attacks by British forces. George Washington himself issued detailed orders about watch procedures, drawing on the centuries of accumulated wisdom that English colonists had brought with them. The failure of watch systems could mean military disaster, as nearly happened at several points in the war when exhausted or untrained watchmen failed to detect approaching enemy forces.
After independence, the American watch system began its slow decline, following the same trajectory as its European predecessors, but with a characteristically American twist. The introduction of professional police forces, beginning with New York's municipal police in 1845, replaced the amateur and semi-professional watchmen with full-time uniformed officers who worked all hours, not just the night. The watch's fire warning function was taken over by dedicated fire departments, with steam-powered equipment that could respond faster than any bell-ringing watchman. And the moral function of the watch, the nightly reminder of civic virtue and community connection, was left without any obvious substitute.
Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. We've traveled through centuries of darkness together, from medieval Nuremberg to colonial Boston, from the bells of the Nachtwächter to the silence that followed the gas lamps. If this story has changed how you think about the night, about the invisible labor that makes civilization possible, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What surprised you most? What made you think differently about our modern world? What parallels do you see between the watchman's count and the systems that hold our societies together now? I read every single comment.
Now let me bring this story to its conclusion, because the end of the Winter Watch is not just a historical curiosity. It's a meditation on what we lose when we solve problems so thoroughly that we forget they ever existed.
The last professional Nachtwächter in Germany is often said to have retired in 1920, though this is almost certainly an oversimplification. Some small towns maintained ceremonial watchmen into the 1930s and even beyond.
A few German cities have revived the tradition for tourism, employing men to dress in traditional garb and walk traditional routes, calling traditional calls at traditional hours. But these are performances, not functions. The real winter watch, the watch that kept people alive, ended somewhere in the late 19th or early 20th century, not with a bang, but with a gradual fading into irrelevance.
The same story played out across the Western world. England's watch system transformed into professional policing, France's into the gendarmerie, America's into the layered systems of municipal police, fire departments, emergency services that now blanket every city. The functions that one man with a bell once performed are now distributed across dozens of specialized services, each more effective at its specific task than any watchman could be. We have won the battle against the night so completely that most people alive today have never experienced true darkness at all.
And yet, something was lost in that victory. The winter watchman did more than keep time and watch for fires and deter criminals. He provided a nightly ritual of reassurance that no modern system replicates. He created a human connection between the sleeping and the waking. He demonstrated through his physical presence in the cold and the dark that the community cared enough about each of its members to put someone on guard. The modern equivalents, the street lamp and the police car and the smoke detector, are more effective technologies, but they are technologies. They do not sing. They do not call. They do not count the hours and remind us that we count too.
The quiet justice of the winter watch was always imperfect. We've seen how watchmen could be corrupt, how the system favored the wealthy, how informal mercy could shade into preferential treatment. The modern professional systems that replace the watch are in many ways more just, because they're more consistent. A smoke detector doesn't care who owns the house. A streetlight illuminates rich and poor equally. The watchman's discretion has been replaced by bureaucratic procedure, and bureaucratic procedure, for all its flaws, doesn't play favorites the way individual humans do.
But bureaucratic procedure also doesn't know your name. It doesn't notice when your chimney hasn't smoked for 3 days. It doesn't give a warning instead of making an arrest when the situation calls for mercy. It doesn't create relationships between neighbors who would otherwise remain strangers. The watchman was embedded in the community in a way that modern emergency services are not. He was part of the social fabric, for better and worse. His replacement by impersonal systems is, in aggregate, clearly positive. Lives are saved, fires are detected, crimes are prevented. But something has been subtracted from the texture of community life that no efficiency metric captures.
This is the paradox of progress. Every problem we solve makes the solution to that problem invisible. We no longer think about fire watch because fires rarely spread between buildings anymore. We no longer think about night terror because the night is no longer terrifying. We no longer think about the count of hours because time is everywhere, on every phone and computer and appliance. The winter watch has become so thoroughly obsolete that most people have never heard of it. The problems it solved feel like non-problems, things that could never have been serious, surely. But they were serious, deadly serious. The bells that Heinrich rang in Nuremberg in 1407 were the difference between a city that held together through winter and a city that fell apart. The count he kept was the count of civilization itself, the assertion that time had structure and that structure would continue. We have found better ways to make that assertion. The assertion itself remains necessary. Every society needs something that plays the role the bells once played. A shared rhythm, a public acknowledgement of time passing, a reminder that someone is paying attention.
What do we have that serves this function now? The question is harder to answer than it might seem. We have shared media that creates common reference points. We have social networks that maintain connection across distance. We have the background hum of always-on digital presence that assures us others are awake and online somewhere. But none of these feel like the bells felt. None of them require someone to stand in the cold and demonstrate care through physical presence. None of them count the hours as a gift from one neighbor to another.
The sociologist Emil Durkheim argued that traditional societies were held together by mechanical solidarity, the sense of being alike, while modern societies rely on organic solidarity, the sense of being interdependent through specialization. The Winter Watch was mechanical solidarity in its purest form. The watchman was not a specialist. He was any man, potentially, doing what any man might do. His service demonstrated that the community was the kind of community where people took turns keeping watch. The shift to professional services is a shift to organic solidarity. Specialists do what specialists do best, and the rest of us go about our specialized business. It's more efficient, it's probably more just, but it doesn't feel the same.
The pandemic of 2020 offered a strange glimpse of what the return of communal vulnerability might feel like. Suddenly, problems that had seemed solved, disease, supply chain disruption, the basic mechanics of keeping society running, became visible again. People noticed essential workers for perhaps the first time, recognized that someone was stocking shelves and driving trucks and staffing hospitals while everyone else sheltered. The applause for healthcare workers that briefly became a global phenomenon had something of the Winter Watch's spirit, a nightly ritual of acknowledgement that someone was standing guard.
That applause faded, as rituals do when the immediate crisis passes. We returned to taking essential services for granted, which is what progress enables us to do. But the memory lingers. The recognition that our complex societies depend on people doing essential but invisible work, that the bells must ring even when we don't hear them, that someone must count the hours for the count to continue. Heinrich of Nuremberg would have understood. John Atay Wood of London would have nodded. Thomas P. of Massachusetts would have recognized the feeling exactly. The work changes. The need for the work doesn't.
Let me tell you one more story before we end. In 2019, I visited the city of Rottenburg ob der Tauber in Germany, one of the few places that still maintains a ceremonial Nachtwächter tradition. The watchman, a man named Hans, dresses in the traditional black cloak and carries the traditional lantern and walks the traditional route through the old town, calling out the hours in the traditional way. It's a tourist attraction now, officially. Hans charges a few euros for the privilege of following him through the cobblestone streets as he performs the ancient ritual.
But something happened on the night I followed Hans that suggested the performance was more than just performance. It was January and cold, though nothing like the cold of 1407. The tour group was small, maybe a dozen people, bundled in modern technical fabrics that would have seemed like magic to Heinrich. We followed Hans through the narrow streets, listening to his calls, watching his lantern bob against the ancient walls. And at one point, as we passed a dark window, Hans paused. He looked at the window for a long moment. Then he knocked on the door.
An old woman answered. Hans spoke to her in German too rapid for me to follow. The woman looked surprised, then grateful. She said something back. Hans nodded, touched his cap, and we moved on. I asked him later what had happened. He explained that the woman was a long-time resident, someone he knew from his real job as a municipal employee. He had noticed that her usual nightlight wasn't on, and he wanted to check that she was all right. She was. She had simply forgotten to turn it on. But the checking mattered.
That moment crystallized everything this story has been building toward.
Hans was performing a role, yes, he was a tourist attraction, technically. But in that pause, in that knock, in that brief exchange with an old woman who might have been forgotten if no one was watching, he was also something else. He was a watchman. He was doing what watchmen have always done, paying attention when no one requires it, noticing what might go unnoticed, demonstrating through small acts that someone cares whether the night passes safely. The bells may have fallen silent, the count may have been transferred to machines, but the spirit of the watch can survive in anyone who chooses to carry it. This is what the Winter Watch reveals about quiet justice and survival. Justice isn't just courts and laws and punishments. It's also attention. It's noticing who needs help. It's creating systems that don't let people fall through cracks. It's the discretionary mercy that sees a woman carrying bread to her starving sister and looks the other way. And survival isn't just individual endurance. It's collective persistence. It's showing up night after night, winter after winter, ringing the bells because the bells must be rung. It's doing the necessary things when no one is watching and no glory will follow.
We don't need watchmen anymore, not in the literal sense. We have better technologies for everything the watchman did. But we still need what the watchman represented, the human commitment to communal welfare, the willingness to stand in the code for strangers, the discipline to count the hours when counting seems pointless. We need people who will knock on doors when the light isn't on. We need systems that maintain the count even when the count is hard. We need, in short, to remember that the bells once rang, and why they rang, and what was at stake when they stopped.
Heinrich of Nuremberg, standing on his wall in the brutal cold of 1407, didn't know he was participating in something that would one day be obsolete. He didn't know that mechanical clocks would make his count unnecessary, that gas lights would banish the darkness he fought, that professional police would take over his patrol. He only knew that it was cold and dark, and someone had to keep watching. So he did. He rang his bells. He called his calls. He kept the count that kept the city alive.
The bells have fallen silent now. The watchmen have gone to their rest. But somewhere in the night, someone is still counting. Someone is still paying attention. Someone is still doing the quiet work that holds civilization together. Maybe it's a nurse on the night shift. Maybe it's a parent checking on a sleeping child. Maybe it's a friend texting to make sure you got home safely. The forms change. The function continues. The count goes on. It's late now. The hour is advanced. Whatever time zone you're in, wherever you are, I hope you're somewhere warm and safe. I hope the night passes peacefully for you. I hope you have people who would notice if your light wasn't on, who would knock on your door to check. And I hope that sometimes when you hear a distant sound in the darkness, a clock chiming, a dog barking, a car passing, you'll remember that once, not so long ago, that sound might have been a bell, a single bell, rung by a single man, standing alone in the cold, counting the hours until dawn.
Hear ye, good people, and let me tell ye, the clock has struck, the watch is set, all is well.
Good night.